The day my brother called me sobbing, saying his daughter was dying and he needed $50,000 to save her life, I gave him every penny I had without hesitation. 6 months later, I saw something that made me hire a private investigator. What I discovered wasn't just a lie, it was a betrayal so calculated, so cruel, that it destroyed our family forever. Some people will exploit even the idea of a dying child. Before I tell you about the lie that shattered my family, I need to tell you about my brother Richard. Because understanding who he was, or who I thought he was, is essential to understanding how he was able to deceive me so completely. Richard was my older brother by 5 years. Growing up, he was my protector, my hero, the person I looked up to more than anyone else in the world. When kids teased me at school, Richard would step in. When I struggled with homework, Richard would help me. When our father died suddenly when I was 12, Richard stepped up and became the man of the house, helping our mother keep the family together. Richard was charismatic and charming, the kind of person who made friends everywhere he went. He was good-looking and athletic, popular in high school, the homecoming king who dated the prettiest girls. Everyone loved Richard. He had that kind of magnetic personality that drew people to him. But even back then, there were signs of something underneath the charm. Richard had a tendency to exaggerate stories, to make himself look better or more important than he was. He'd tell tales about accomplishments that seemed a bit too perfect, experiences that seemed a bit too dramatic. Our mother would sometimes catch him in these embellishments and gently correct him. Richard would laugh it off, saying he was just making the story more interesting, that there was no harm in it. As we got older, Richard's charm served him well in some ways and poorly in others. He drifted from job to job, always with grand plans that never quite materialized. He'd get hired somewhere with enthusiasm, talking about how this was going to be his big break, how he was going to rise through the company and make something of himself. Then, a few months later, there'd be some problem. A boss who didn't appreciate him, co-workers who were jealous of him, a company that didn't understand his vision. Richard always had explanations for why things didn't work out, and those explanations always made him the victim of circumstances beyond his control. He married a woman named Linda when he was 28. Linda was sweet but quiet, the kind of person who faded into the background while Richard commanded the room. They had a daughter, Melissa, 2 years into their marriage. I adored Melissa from the moment I met her. She was a beautiful baby with Richard's big eyes and Linda's gentle smile. As she grew, she was creative and thoughtful, always drawing pictures or making up stories. I was the aunt who spoiled her with books and art supplies, who took her to museums and parks, who was there for birthdays and school plays. Richard struggled financially throughout Melissa's childhood. He'd call me every few months with some crisis. The rent was due and he was short. The car had broken down and he couldn't afford repairs. Melissa needed school supplies and they didn't have money for them. I helped whenever I could. I'd send a few $100s here and there. I never expected to be paid back. Richard was family, and family helped each other. Besides, I thought about Melissa. Whatever Richard's shortcomings, his daughter shouldn't suffer because of them. Over the years, I probably gave Richard $20,000 in these small amounts. My husband Henry would sometimes question whether we should keep enabling Richard's poor financial planning. I'd defend Richard, saying he was going through a rough patch, that he'd get back on his feet eventually. But Richard never quite got back on his feet. The crises kept coming. The jobs kept failing. The explanations kept flowing about why nothing was ever his fault. When Melissa was 16, Linda left Richard. She'd apparently had enough of the financial instability and Richard's inability to take responsibility for anything. The divorce was messy. Linda got custody of Melissa, and Richard got visitation rights. Richard called me crying when Linda left. He said he couldn't believe she'd abandoned him, that he'd given her everything, that she was destroying their family. He said Melissa was devastated. He painted himself as the victim of a cruel, ungrateful wife. I believed him at the time. I felt sorry for him. I invited him to stay with Henry and me for a few weeks while he got back on his feet. Those few weeks turned into 3 months. Richard would talk about looking for work, about getting his life together, about fighting for his daughter. But mostly, he'd sit around our house, watching television, eating our food, and telling anyone who'd listen how unfairly life had treated him. Henry finally had a conversation with Richard about needing to move out and stand on his own. Richard acted hurt and offended, but he left. He found an apartment and got a job at a call center. For a while, things seemed stable. Melissa went to college and started building her own life. She'd visit Richard occasionally, but their relationship was strained. She'd visit me more often, and during those visits, she'd sometimes let slip things that made me wonder about Richard. She'd mention how her father was always asking her for money, how he'd show up at her dorm unannounced, expecting her to drop everything to spend time with him, how he'd tell her mother that Melissa hated her, which wasn't true, just to create drama. I started to see that maybe Linda's version of the marriage, if I'd ever bothered to ask for it, might have been very different from Richard's. But Richard was my brother, and I wanted to believe the best of him. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening in March. I was making dinner when my phone rang. Richard's name appeared on the screen. I answered, expecting another request for a small loan or another tale of workplace injustice. Instead, I heard sobbing. Richard was crying so hard he could barely speak. My immediate thought was that something had happened to Melissa. My heart started pounding as I asked him what was wrong. Through the tears, Richard told me that Melissa was sick, very sick. She'd been diagnosed with leukemia and needed immediate treatment, aggressive chemotherapy, possibly a bone marrow transplant. The treatment was going to be expensive, and Melissa's insurance through school wasn't going to cover everything. Richard said the doctors had given Melissa a good prognosis if she could get the treatment right away, but without it, she might have only months to live. He said Melissa was scared and so was he. He said he'd do anything to save his daughter, but he didn't have the money. He said he needed $50,000 to cover the uncovered medical expenses, the experimental treatments, the specialist consultations. He said he'd been to banks, tried to get loans, but his credit was too bad. He'd asked everyone he knew. I was his last hope. Honey, I didn't hesitate. Not for a second. Melissa was my niece, practically like a daughter to me. If she needed $50,000 to live, she'd have it. I told Richard I'd get him the money immediately. I hung up and told Henry what had happened. Henry was shocked and saddened by the news. He also asked some practical questions that I was too emotionally overwhelmed to consider. Which hospital was Melissa at? What type of leukemia did she have? Had Richard talked to social workers about financial assistance programs? I didn't have answers to any of those questions. I called Richard back and asked. He said Melissa was at a hospital about 3 hours away, that she was getting the best care available. He said the type of leukemia was acute myeloid leukemia, an aggressive form that needed immediate treatment. He said they'd looked into assistance programs but didn't qualify because of various technicalities. Henry suggested we go visit Melissa at the hospital. Richard said that wasn't possible right now. Melissa was undergoing tests and procedures and couldn't have visitors. He said she'd asked him not to tell anyone because she didn't want people seeing her when she was weak and sick. He said once treatment started and she was feeling better, we could visit. Looking back, honey, the red flags were everywhere, but I was in emotional shock, terrified for Melissa, and I wanted to believe my brother was telling the truth about something so serious. The next day, I went to my bank and initiated a wire transfer of $50,000 to Richard's account. It was nearly all of my savings, money Henry and I had accumulated over decades of careful budgeting and planning. It was supposed to be for our retirement, for emergencies, for security in our old age. But it was also for saving Melissa's life, and that was worth more than any retirement plan. Richard called when he received the money. He was crying again, thanking me, saying I'd saved Melissa's life, that he'd never forget what I'd done, that he'd pay me back somehow. He said the doctors were starting treatment immediately now that they could afford it. I asked how Melissa was doing emotionally. Richard said she was trying to stay strong but was understandably scared. He said she appreciated my help but was still too weak to talk on the phone or receive visitors. Over the next few weeks, I'd call Richard every few days for updates. He'd tell me about Melissa's treatment, how the chemotherapy was making her nauseous, how she'd lost her hair, how some days were better than others. He'd describe sitting with her at the hospital, holding her hand, trying to keep her spirits up. The stories were detailed and emotional. Richard would cry as he described how brave Melissa was being, how she'd smile even when she was clearly in pain, how she'd talk about her plans for after she recovered. I'd cry too, my heart breaking for what my niece was going through. I'd ask Richard what I could do to help. He'd say that the money had been the biggest help, that everything else was just a matter of getting through the treatment. About a month after I'd given Richard the money, he called with more bad news. The first round of treatment hadn't worked as well as hoped. The doctors were recommending a more aggressive approach, which meant more expenses. He needed another $10,000. I didn't have another $10,000. I'd given Richard nearly everything I had, but I took out a loan against our house. $10,000 that I borrowed against our equity, adding a monthly payment to our budget that we'd have to stretch to afford. I sent Richard the additional money. He thanked me profusely and said this would be enough, that after this, Melissa should be in the clear. 2 weeks later, he called needing $5,000 more. Then, 3 weeks after that, another $8,000. Each time, the story was the same unexpected expenses, treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, medications that Melissa needed. Each time, I found the money somehow. I borrowed from my retirement account. I got a second loan. I asked my church for help, telling them my niece was fighting cancer. Henry started expressing serious concerns. He said we were going into debt to fund these medical expenses, and maybe we should be talking directly to Melissa's doctors, understanding exactly what was happening, seeing if there were other sources of financial assistance. I defended Richard. I said he was dealing with his daughter's illness, that he probably wasn't thinking clearly about all the options, that we just needed to trust him and help. But Henry's questions planted seeds of doubt. Why couldn't we visit Melissa? Why couldn't I talk to her directly? Why did Richard always have vague answers when I asked specific questions about her treatment? I told myself I was being paranoid. Richard wouldn't lie about something like this. Nobody would fabricate their child having cancer just to get money. It was unthinkable. Then, about 6 months after I'd given Richard the initial $50,000, I was at the grocery store in the evening, and I saw Melissa. She was with a group of friends, laughing and putting groceries into her cart. She looked healthy. Her hair was long and thick. She was moving normally, energetically, with no signs of the weakness that chemotherapy would cause. I stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, watching her. She was about 30 feet away, too far for me to see every detail, but she looked nothing like someone undergoing aggressive cancer treatment. I thought maybe I was mistaken, that it was someone who looked like Melissa, but then she turned and I saw her face clearly. It was definitely my niece. I started walking toward her, but something stopped me. Some instinct told me not to approach her yet, not to reveal that I'd seen her. Instead, I quickly left the store and sat in my car, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. There could be explanations. Maybe Melissa was in remission and Richard hadn't told me yet because he wanted to surprise me. Maybe she was having a good day and had felt well enough to go out. Maybe she was wearing a wig that looked like her real hair. But something in my gut told me those explanations were excuses. Something was very wrong. When I got home, I told Henry what I'd seen. He was quiet for a long moment, then said what I was afraid to think, that maybe Melissa had never been sick at all, that maybe Richard had lied about everything. I didn't want to believe it, but I also couldn't ignore what I'd seen. I called Melissa's phone. She answered on the third ring, sounding cheerful and healthy. I asked her how she was doing. She said she was great, that school was going well, that she'd just finished a big project and was celebrating with friends. I asked carefully if there was anything going on with her health. She laughed and said no, she was healthy as could be. I asked if she'd been to the doctor recently. She said not since her routine checkup in the fall, which had been months ago. I made some excuse to end the call, saying I just wanted to check in. Melissa said it was nice to hear from me and that we should get together soon. After I hung up, I sat with the terrible knowledge that my brother had lied to me. Melissa wasn't sick. She'd never had leukemia. There had been no chemotherapy, no aggressive treatment, no fight for her life. Richard had made it all up to get money from me. I felt physically sick. I ran to the bathroom and vomited. Henry held my hair back and rubbed my shoulders while I cried. I'd given Richard $73,000 total over the past 6 months. $73,000 that we didn't have, that we'd borrowed and scraped together, believing we were saving Melissa's life. And it had all been a lie. The next morning, I called a private investigator that my attorney had recommended years ago for a different matter. His name was Michael, and he specialized in financial fraud and missing persons cases. I told him the situation. I told him about the money, about the supposed cancer diagnosis, about seeing Melissa healthy at the grocery store. I asked him to investigate Richard and find out what he'd done with the money. Michael took the case. Over the next 3 weeks, he uncovered everything. Richard had never taken Melissa to a hospital. There was no cancer diagnosis. Melissa didn't even know that Richard had told me she was sick. He'd fabricated the entire story without her knowledge. The money I'd sent had gone to pay off Richard's gambling debts. Richard had developed a serious gambling problem over the past 2 years. He'd been going to a casino about an hour from his apartment 2 or 3 times a week. He'd been playing poker and blackjack, convinced he had a system that would make him rich. Instead, he'd lost everything. His savings, his credit cards, his ability to pay rent. He'd borrowed from loan sharks who charged extortionate interest rates. He'd gotten so deep in debt that the loan sharks had started threatening him. Richard needed $70,000 to pay off his gambling debts and the predatory loans. He'd known I didn't have that kind of money available. So he'd created a scenario he knew I couldn't refuse a dying niece who needed immediate help. Michael found bank records showing the wire transfers from me going into Richard's account, followed immediately by transfers to various creditors and to cash withdrawals made at the casino. Michael found security footage from the casino showing Richard there on multiple occasions during the months when he'd told me he was sitting at Melissa's hospital bedside. Michael found text messages between Richard and a friend where Richard had actually discussed the plan before implementing it. The messages showed Richard calculating how much money he could get from me, what story would be most effective, how to keep me from asking too many questions. It had all been calculated, premeditated. Richard had looked at his financial problems and decided the solution was to exploit my love for my niece and my trust in him. When Michael presented me with all the evidence, I sat in his office and felt something inside me die. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a systematic plan to defraud me, to use my emotions as a weapon against me. I asked Michael what legal options I had. He said I could report Richard for fraud. The amount involved, over $70,000, would make it a serious felony. Richard would likely face prison time. I went home and talked to Henry about what to do. Part of me wanted to go to the police immediately. Part of me couldn't bear the thought of my own brother going to prison, even though he deserved it. Henry said the decision was mine, but that Richard needed to face consequences for what he'd done. He said if Richard got away with this, he'd just do it to someone else. He might already be doing it to other people. I decided to confront Richard first, to give him one chance to explain himself before I went to the police. I called Richard and told him I needed to see him immediately. He asked what was wrong. I said we needed to talk in person and that it couldn't wait. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop the next morning. When I walked into the coffee shop, Richard was already there, looking nervous. He'd probably sensed from my tone that something was wrong. I sat down across from him and asked him how Melissa was doing. Richard's face brightened, and he started into his usual update about her treatment, how she was responding well, how the doctors were optimistic. I let him talk for a few minutes, this elaborate fiction he'd created. Then I told him I'd seen Melissa at the grocery store. I told him she looked perfectly healthy. I told him I'd talked to her and she'd mentioned nothing about being sick. Richard's expression changed. Panic flashed across his face, followed quickly by calculation. He started to say that Melissa was in remission, that she was doing better, that he'd been meaning to tell me. I cut him off. I told him I'd hired a private investigator. I told him I knew there had never been any cancer diagnosis. I knew about the gambling debts. I knew about the casino. I knew he'd planned the entire con before he'd ever called me crying about Melissa. Richard's face went white. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he started to cry, not the genuine tears of someone caught doing something terrible, but the practiced tears of someone trying to manipulate his way out of consequences. He started making excuses. He said he'd been desperate. He said the loan sharks were threatening to hurt him. He said he'd panicked and made a terrible decision. He said he'd always planned to pay me back once his luck turned around at the casino. I asked him how he could have used Melissa like that, how he could have lied about his own daughter having cancer. Richard said he'd known it was the one thing I couldn't refuse. He'd known that I'd give him anything if I thought Melissa's life was at stake. His honesty about his manipulation was almost worse than the lie itself. He wasn't even pretending he felt guilty about using my love for my niece against me. I told Richard I had two options. I could go to the police with all the evidence Michael had gathered, or Richard could sign a promissory note committing to pay back every cent he'd stolen, with interest, on a payment plan we'd establish with my attorney. Richard quickly agreed to the promissory note. He said he'd sign whatever I wanted, that he'd pay me back, that he was so sorry for what he'd done. We met with my attorney the following week. The attorney drew up a legally binding document requiring Richard to pay back $73,000 plus interest over the next 5 years. The monthly payments would be substantial, over $1,400 a month. Richard signed the document. He looked relieved, probably thinking he'd gotten away with it, that this was better than prison. I told him one more thing before we left the attorney's office. I told him that if he missed a single payment, I'd go to the police with all the evidence. I told him that our relationship as brother and sister was over. I told him that I never wanted to see him or speak to him again unless it was about the repayment schedule. I also told him I was going to tell Melissa the truth about what he'd done. Richard begged me not to tell Melissa. He said it would destroy their relationship. I told him he should have thought about that before he used her as a prop in his con. I met with Melissa the following week and told her everything. She was horrified and heartbroken. She'd had no idea her father had used her supposed illness to steal from me. She apologized profusely, even though none of it was her fault. Melissa's relationship with Richard had already been strained. After learning what he'd done, she cut him off completely. She told him she wanted nothing to do with him until he got help for his gambling addiction and made things right with me. Richard made 3 monthly payments. The 4th month, the payment didn't come. I waited a week, giving him the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe it had been delayed. Then I called him. Richard said he couldn't make the payments anymore. He said the amount was too high, that he couldn't afford it and pay his other bills. He said I'd have to accept smaller payments or nothing at all. I reminded him of our agreement. I reminded him that if he didn't pay, I'd go to the police. Richard said I wouldn't actually do that because he was my brother and I wouldn't want to see him go to prison. He'd miscalculated. 3 days later, I filed a police report with all the evidence Michael had gathered. Richard was arrested and charged with felony fraud. The district attorney said the case was solid, the premeditation, the amount of money involved, the evidence of the gambling debts, the text messages discussing the plan. Richard's court-appointed attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but I refused to support any deal that didn't include restitution and significant jail time. Richard had calculated every move of his con. He deserved to face full consequences. Richard was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The judge ordered full restitution, though everyone acknowledged I'd likely never see most of that money. The judge told Richard that exploiting family trust and fabricating a child's illness for financial gain was particularly reprehensible. Richard is currently serving his sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in another year. I've already told the parole board that I don't support his early release. The financial impact on Henry and me was severe. We're still paying off the loans I took out. We had to postpone retirement. We had to cut back on our lifestyle. Henry had to work 2 more years than he'd planned. The emotional impact was worse. I lost my brother not to death but to the realization that he'd never really been the person I thought he was. All those years of helping him, believing in him, making excuses for him, and he'd been willing to traumatize me with the fictional death of my niece just to get money for gambling debts. The experience taught me hard lessons about trust and boundaries. First, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. Richard had a decades-long pattern of manipulation, excuses, and financial irresponsibility. I'd chosen to overlook those patterns because he was family, but his history had been telling me exactly who he was. I just hadn't wanted to listen. Second, verify before you give. If I'd asked to speak to Melissa's doctors, to see medical records, to visit the hospital, the whole lie would have collapsed immediately. Richard was counting on me being too emotional to think clearly, too trusting to verify his claims. Third, even family members can commit serious fraud. We want to believe our loved ones would never hurt us deliberately. But family relationships can actually make fraud easier because trust is assumed rather than earned. Fourth, consequences matter. If I'd accepted Richard's excuses after he missed his payment, if I'd let him off with a warning, I would have taught him that there were no real consequences for his actions. He'd already learned that lesson too many times in his life. And finally, honey, some relationships can't and shouldn't be saved. Richard wasn't temporarily troubled or making a mistake. He was fundamentally willing to exploit the people who loved him. Cutting him out of my life wasn't cruel, it was necessary self-protection. Melissa is doing well now. She graduated college and started a career as a graphic designer. She and I have grown closer through all of this. She's building a life free from her father's manipulation and dysfunction. Sometimes people ask me if I'll ever forgive Richard. I tell them I've forgiven him in the sense that I don't carry active hatred or desire for revenge. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Richard destroyed my trust, exploited my love, and chose gambling debt over family bonds. Some actions are so fundamentally destructive that the relationship can't survive them. Using the fictional death of your daughter to con your sister is one of those actions. I think about all the hours I spent terrified for Melissa, imagining her suffering, grieving in advance for the loss I thought was coming. That emotional trauma was real, even though the cancer never was. Richard put me through hell for $73,000. The money, as devastating as losing it was, wasn't really the point. The point was the complete betrayal of every bond that should have connected us, the willingness to weaponize my love for my niece, the careful calculation of how to maximize the emotional manipulation. That's not something you come back from. Richard will get out of prison eventually. He'll probably try to contact me, to apologize, to ask for another chance. I've already decided I won't respond. I've mourned the brother I thought I had, and accepted that he never really existed. The investigation and legal process gave me something valuable, though truth. I know exactly what happened. I know it wasn't my fault. I know I acted out of love and was betrayed by someone who should have protected that love. Some people use the people who love them as resources to be exploited. My brother was one of those people. Learning that hurt more than I can express, but knowing it freed me to stop hoping he'd change, stop making excuses for him, stop letting him hurt me. The $50,000 I thought was saving my niece's life actually bought me the truth about who my brother really was. In a strange way, that was worth the price. If this story left you speechless, don't scroll away just yet. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who understands what it feels like to be betrayed by the very people you trusted most. This story isn't just about money, it's about faith, love, and the devastating cost of misplaced trust. When family crosses a line this deep, it reminds us that sometimes the hardest truth is knowing that love isn't enough to change someone who's already decided to hurt you. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own brother lied about his child being sick just to get your money? Would you call the police like I did? Would you forgive him? Or are some betrayals too dark to ever come back from? I want to hear your heart, because these aren't just stories, they're lessons about boundaries, healing, and survival. And honey, if you've ever been taken advantage of, if someone's ever used your kindness as a weapon, know this: you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss another true story that reminds you of your strength, your worth, and your power to say no more. Every like, every comment, and every share keeps these real stories alive. Stories about love, loss, betrayal, and the courage to rise again. Thank you for being part of this community. Together, we're proving that pain can teach, truth can heal, and no lie can destroy who we are inside.